fire does not forget. It does not hesitate. And on a suffocating Alabama night in 1851, when 3 slave catchers rode in with chains and certainty, they believed they were the hunters. They believed the law stood behind them, that fear would open every door, that no man would dare rise against them. But inside a quiet barn, beneath old wood and dry hay, a different kind of justice was waiting, and before the night was over, the hunters would realize too late that they had walked straight into the hands of a man who had already decided no more. Welcome to Shadows of Black History. If you are new to this channel, take a moment to subscribe and like our videos so you never miss the hidden stories that shaped the past. We truly appreciate every single one of you who watches and supports this journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight's story is one you will not want to miss even a single paragraph of. Stay with us until the very end, because what you are about to hear will challenge what you think you know about justice, courage, and survival. So relax, settle in, and let us begin. Alabama in 1851 was a land that carried danger in silence. Tall pine trees lined the narrow roads, while scattered farms stretched across red clay soil that baked beneath the southern sun. To travelers passing through, the region might have seemed calm, even ordinary, but those who lived there understood the truth hidden beneath that quiet surface. The law did not belong to everyone. Freedom did not belong to everyone. And for those who had escaped the chains of slavery, every mile of open land carried the threat of being dragged back into darkness. Slave catchers moved through Alabama with confidence, armed not only with weapons, but with the authority of a system that rewarded their cruelty. They hunted men like animals, tracked footprints through mud and dust, questioned anyone who looked suspicious, and left behind stories of violence that traveled faster than the riders themselves. Fear followed them wherever they went. It settled into homes, crept into conversations, and silenced even the bravest voices. In that world, survival depended on knowing when to speak, when to hide, and when to disappear entirely. On the edge of one such settlement stood a barn that had seen more than its share of secrets. Its wooden boards were weathered and grey, its roof patched in places where storms had torn through in previous years. To most people, it was just another structure used for storing hay and tools, a simple part of rural life. But for a few, it was something far more important. Beneath the rough floorboards, there was a narrow hidden space, built carefully and quietly by hands that understood the risk. It was not large and it was not comfortable, but it was enough. Enough to hide from passing riders, enough to breathe for a few hours without fear, enough to keep hope alive when everything else had been stripped away. The man who watched over that barn was known simply as David. Some called him Iron Hands, though never loudly and never in front of strangers. The name had come from years of labor that had shaped his body into something powerful and unyielding. His hands were thick with scars, his grip strong enough to bend tools when frustration took hold. But those who truly knew him understood that his strength ran deeper than muscle. It lived in his silence, in the way he observed the world around him, in the patience he carried like a shield against a life that had given him every reason to break. David had learned early that anger alone could not win against a system built on control. He had seen men act on impulse and pay for it with their lives. He had watched families torn apart because someone spoke too loudly or trusted the wrong person. So he became careful. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered faces, voices, patterns. He knew which roads were safest after dark, which homes might offer a drink of water, which paths led into the deeper woods, where riders rarely ventured. Over time, people began to rely on him, though no one ever said so openly. When someone needed guidance, they found their way to David. When someone needed to disappear for a night, they were led quietly toward the barn. And when news traveled through the region about slave catchers moving closer, David was always one of the first to hear it. That knowledge carried weight. It meant responsibility. It meant that every decision he made could affect not only his own life, but the lives of others who trusted him to act wisely. He carried that burden without complaint, though it settled deeper inside him with each passing year. The evening that changed everything arrived heavy with heat and tension. The air felt thick, almost unmoving, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Word had spread quickly that 3 slave catchers had been seen riding toward the settlement. These were not unknown men. Their names had traveled through whispers and warnings long before they ever appeared on the road. They were experienced, ruthless, and patient. They knew how to track a man through dense forest, how to read broken branches and disturbed soil, how to turn fear into a weapon. By the time the sun began to sink behind the trees, doors across the settlement had already been closed. Lamps were dimmed. Conversations were cut short. No one wanted to draw attention on a night like this. David stood near the barn, his eyes scanning the distant road where dust sometimes rose in the fading light. He did not move much, but his stillness was not calm. It was focus. It was calculation. Then, just as the last glow of sunlight began to fade, 2 figures appeared at the edge of the property, stumbling forward with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. Their clothes were torn, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt, their breathing sharp and uneven. They had been running. They had been hunted. And now, they were here. David did not ask their names. He did not ask where they had come from. He saw everything he needed to see in their eyes. Without a word, he led them toward the barn, moving quickly, but without panic. Inside, the scent of hay filled the air as the last traces of daylight slipped through the cracks in the wooden walls. He knelt and pulled back the loose boards from the floor, revealing the narrow space beneath. The men hesitated only for a second before climbing down into the darkness, their bodies pressing into the tight space as they tried to quiet their breathing. David replaced the boards carefully, covering every sign of disturbance. For a moment he remained kneeling there, his hand resting lightly against the wood as if he could feel the fear beneath it. Then he stood and stepped back into the open air. The sky had darkened completely now, and the first distant sound of approaching horses drifted through the night. It was faint, but unmistakable. The hunters had arrived. The sound of hooves grew louder against the hard Alabama ground, steady and deliberate, carrying with it the weight of authority and danger. David remained where he stood beside the barn, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, though every sense inside him sharpened with quiet intensity. The night had fully settled now, wrapping the land in darkness, broken only by faint starlight and the distant glow of lanterns from scattered homes. The riders appeared slowly along the narrow road, their figures emerging from the shadows like something pulled from the dark itself. 3 men, mounted and armed, their movements confident, their presence heavy with purpose. They did not rush. Men like them never needed to. They believed time worked in their favor, that fear would flush out anyone hiding long before patience ran out. As they approached the barn, one of them lifted a lantern, its flickering light casting long, shifting shadows across the ground. The glow revealed their faces in pieces, hard lines, cold eyes, expressions shaped by years of hunting other human beings. David watched them without flinching. He had imagined this moment before, though imagination never fully captured the reality of standing face to face with men who carried chains as easily as others carried tools. The lead rider brought his horse to a slow stop a few steps from the barn. He studied David for a moment, his gaze sharp and searching, as if trying to measure the man standing before him. Then he spoke, his voice calm but edged with authority. He asked if anyone had passed through the area that evening. David answered simply, his tone steady, his words chosen carefully. He said he had seen no one. The man did not immediately respond. Instead, he dismounted slowly, boots pressing into the dirt as he stepped closer. The other two riders followed, spreading out slightly as they moved, their eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced attention. One of them circled toward the side of the barn, running his hand along the wooden boards, as if he could feel the secrets hidden beneath them. The second remained near the horses, watching both David and the surrounding darkness. The lead catcher stopped just a few feet away, close enough that David could smell the leather of his coat and the faint scent of tobacco clinging to his breath. He spoke again, this time with a hint of suspicion creeping into his voice. He said they were tracking two escaped men, and he made it clear that anyone found helping fugitives would face consequences just as severe as those who ran. David listened without reacting. Inside, his thoughts moved quickly, calculating every word, every movement, every possible outcome. The search began without further warning. The man circling the barn pushed open the side door and stepped inside, his lantern casting restless light across the hay, stacked against the walls. Dust rose into the air as he moved, his boots crunching softly against the dry ground. The second catcher soon followed, their voices low as they began checking every corner, every shadow, every space large enough to hide a person. David remained outside with the lead man, his body still, his breathing controlled. The silence between them stretched thin, broken only by the faint sounds coming from inside the barn. A shift of wood, the scrape of a boot, the dull thud of something being moved aside. Beneath the floor, hidden in darkness, the two men held their breath, their bodies pressed tightly against the earth, aware that discovery would mean chains, punishment, and likely death. David knew they could not stay hidden forever if the search continued. The loose boards would draw attention sooner or later. The catchers were too experienced to overlook something that did not belong. He needed to act, but the moment had to be exact. Too early, and suspicion would sharpen. Too late, and everything would be lost. Inside the barn, the search grew more aggressive. One of the men began using his boot to kick at the floor in different places, listening for changes in sound. The dull thud of solid ground echoed through most of the space, but when his foot struck near the loose boards, the sound shifted slightly, just enough to catch attention. The man paused. He struck the spot again, harder this time. The difference was subtle, but it was there. He called out to the others, his voice carrying a note of certainty. Outside, the lead catcher turned his head toward the sound, his expression tightening as he realized they might have found something. In that moment, time seemed to slow. David felt the shift before it fully happened. He saw the recognition in the man's eyes. He understood that within seconds, the boards would be lifted, the hidden space revealed, and the two men beneath would be dragged out into the night. Everything he had done to protect them would collapse in an instant. The path that had been forming in his mind since the moment he heard the distant hooves now stood directly before him. There would be no second chance, no safer opportunity, no turning back. The fire that had been building quietly inside him for years, fed by every story, every injustice, every memory, suddenly found its moment. And as the man inside the barn reached down toward the loose boards, David Ironhands made his decision. The moment did not arrive with noise or chaos. It came in silence, sharp and final, like a blade cutting through hesitation. As the man inside the barn bent toward the loose boards, David moved. His hand closed around the heavy wooden latch on the outside of the barn door, and in one swift motion, he pulled it shut with force. The sound of wood slamming against wood echoed through the night, sudden and unmistakable. For a split second, there was confusion inside. One of the catchers shouted, demanding to know what had happened. The second rushed toward the door, but before he could reach it, David dropped the iron bar into place, locking the entrance from the outside. The lead catcher spun around, his expression shifting from suspicion to realization in an instant. He lunged forward, but David had already stepped back, his movements controlled, his face calm in a way that made the moment even more unsettling. Inside the barn, fists pounded against the door, voices rising in anger and disbelief. They shouted orders, threats, promises of punishment that would come if the door was not opened immediately. But the balance had already shifted. For the first time that night, the hunters were no longer in control. David did not rush. Every step he took was deliberate, guided by a decision that had been forming long before this moment arrived. He turned and walked toward the side of the barn where dry hay was stacked high against the outer wall. The night air felt heavier now, thick with tension and something else, something final. Behind him, the pounding on the door grew louder, more desperate. One of the men began kicking from the inside, the force of each strike shaking the wood. Another shouted that they would break through if given enough time. David knew that might be true. The barn was strong, but it was not built to withstand a determined assault from within. Time, once again, was the most dangerous factor. He reached down and gathered a bundle of dry hay, its brittle texture crackling softly in his hands. For a brief moment he paused, not because he doubted what he was about to do, but because he understood exactly what it meant. There was no path back from this. What came next would not be hidden in silence or carried away by whispers. It would leave a mark that could not be erased. The memory of his own past, of chains, of suffering, of men hunted like animals, rose within him. And with it came the understanding that some acts of justice are born not from anger alone, but from the refusal to allow cruelty to continue without answer. Inside the barn, the realization spread quickly. The voices changed. The anger that had filled them moments before began to shift into something sharper. Edged with fear. They shouted louder now. Not just commands, but demands. Threats mixed with something closer to desperation. They promised reward if the door was opened. They warned of consequences if it was not. The pounding grew frantic, the rhythm uneven as panic began to take hold. One of them fired a shot, the sound exploding through the night as the bullet struck the wooden wall from the inside. Splinters burst outward, scattering across the ground. David did not flinch. He stepped closer to the barn, placing the bundle of hay carefully against the base of the wall. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of flint and steel. Something simple, something ordinary. Yet in this moment it carried the weight of everything. His hands moved with steady precision as he struck the flint. Sparks jumped into the dry hay, flickering briefly before catching. At first the flame was small, almost fragile, dancing lightly against the brittle strands. But dry hay does not resist for long. Within seconds the fire began to grow, feeding on the material, spreading along the base of the wall with quiet hunger. The transformation was swift. What began as a small flicker became a crawling line of flame, then a rising wall of fire that climbed the wooden boards with alarming speed. Heat pushed outward into the night, carrying the sharp scent of burning hay and old timber. Inside the barn, the voices turned to shouting, then to something else entirely. The pounding against the door became frantic, desperate, the force of it shaking the structure as the men inside realized the full extent of what was happening. They called out again, but their words no longer carried authority. They carried fear, real fear, the kind they had once inspired in others. The fire spread upward, licking across the dry wood, reaching the stacked hay within, turning the entire structure into fuel. Smoke began to rise, thick and choking, curling into the night sky as the flames grew brighter. David stepped back. his face illuminated by the growing firelight. In that glow, his expression remained steady, not cold, not cruel, but resolved. He watched as the barn that had once hidden hope now became something else entirely, a place where the balance of power had shifted in the most final way possible. The night, once silent, now roared with the sound of burning wood and collapsing structure. And in that fire, the hunters who had arrived with chains found themselves trapped inside the very fate they had brought with them. The fire rose higher with each passing moment, devouring the barn with a hunger that could not be slowed or reasoned with. Flames climbed the wooden walls and burst through the roof, sending sparks spinning into the dark Alabama sky like a storm of burning stars. The heat pushed outward in waves, forcing the night itself to retreat from the growing blaze. The sounds from inside the barn had changed completely now. The pounding, the shouting, the commands that once carried authority had dissolved into desperate cries that echoed across the land. The structure groaned as the beams began to weaken, the weight of the fire pressing down on every part of it. David stood several steps away, his body still, his eyes fixed on the inferno before him. The glow of the flames reflected in his gaze, but there was no triumph there, no wild satisfaction. What filled him instead was something heavier, something final. The act had been done. The path had been chosen. And now there was no undoing it. Behind him, hidden beneath the floor, that was now beginning to collapse, the two men he had protected remained trapped between fear and hope, waiting for the moment when escape might be possible. David knew he could not reach them until the fire shifted, until the danger changed shape. Every second mattered. The blaze did not remain unnoticed for long. Light from the fire spread across the fields, casting a bright and violent glow that could be seen from a distance. Within minutes, doors began to open across the settlement. Figures emerged into the night, drawn by the sight of flames rising high above the barn. Voices called out in confusion, in alarm, in fear of what might be happening. Some believed it was an accident, a stray spark catching dry hay in the heat of summer. Others sensed something deeper, something deliberate. As people moved closer, they slowed when they saw the intensity of the fire, the way it consumed everything without hesitation. No one rushed forward to put it out. The heat alone made that impossible, but there was something else that held them back. An unspoken understanding that this fire was not just a disaster. It was an event. It was a message. David stepped further into the shadows as the first group of onlookers approached, his figure blending into the darkness beyond the reach of the flames. He did not want to be seen standing too close. Not now. Not when questions would soon begin to rise. The fire roared louder, drowning out distant voices, turning the night into something fierce and unforgettable. As the barn began to collapse inward, the structure giving way under the force of the flames, David moved again. He circled wide, keeping low and hidden as he approached the rear side where the fire had not yet fully taken hold. The heat was still intense, but there were moments, brief and dangerous, where the flames shifted enough to allow passage. He dropped to his knees and pulled at the loose boards from the outside edge where the hidden space connected. Smoke stung his eyes, and the air burned in his lungs as he worked quickly, forcing the wood aside with strength that he had been built through years of labor and survival. Beneath the opening, the two men lay pressed into the dirt, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shock and fear. For a second they did not move, as if unsure whether what they were seeing was real. David reached down and pulled one of them upward, then the other, guiding them out into the open air. They coughed violently as they filled their lungs with smoke-free breath, their bodies trembling from the intensity of what they had just survived. There was no time for words, no time for explanation. David pointed toward the tree line beyond the fields, his gesture clear and urgent. "Run." The men did not hesitate. They turned and disappeared into the darkness, their figures swallowed by the night as they fled toward whatever future waited beyond the reach of the fire. By the time the barn fully collapsed, the flames had reached their peak, roaring high before slowly beginning to settle into a lower, steady burn. The structure that once stood solid and quiet was now nothing more than a heap of glowing embers and falling beams. The people gathered at a distance watched in silence, their faces lit by the fading firelight. Questions hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. How had it started? Why had it spread so quickly? And perhaps most dangerous of all, what had been inside when the fire began? Some whispered about the slave catchers who had been seen riding into the area earlier that evening. Others avoided speaking their names at all, as if saying them might bring unwanted attention. The truth lingered just beneath the surface, unspoken but understood by more than one person standing there. David remained among the shadows, his breathing steady once more, his expression returning to the calm stillness he carried so well. The fire was dying now, but its impact would not fade so easily. This night would travel beyond the settlement. It would move through stories, through whispers, through the quiet understanding that something had changed. And as the last flames flickered against the dark Alabama sky, the legend of David Ironhands began to take shape, carried not by loud voices, but by the quiet certainty that justice, once awakened, does not easily return to silence. Morning arrived slowly over the Alabama fields, but the land did not wake in peace. The place where the barn once stood was now a blackened scar against the red earth. Thin lines of smoke still rising into the cool air, as if the fire refused to fully release its hold on the night before. The smell of ash lingered heavily, carried by a faint breeze that moved through the trees and across the open ground. People gathered at a distance, careful not to step too close, their eyes fixed on what remained. There were no walls left standing, no roof to shelter anything beneath it, only charred beams and collapsed wood that told a story without words. The questions that had begun the night before now pressed harder, sharper, more dangerous. Where were the 3 slave catchers? Why had no one seen them leave? And most troubling of all, what had truly happened inside that barn before the flames took everything? The plantation owners and nearby landholders were quick to arrive, their faces tense as they surveyed the destruction. This was not just a fire. It was a disruption of order, a challenge to the system that depended on control and fear. Something had happened that could not be easily explained, and that alone made it dangerous. By midday, the law had been summoned. Riders brought word to the nearest town, and soon a sheriff arrived with armed deputies, their presence heavy with authority and suspicion. They examined the remains of the barn, walking carefully around the edges of the burned ground, searching for any sign that might reveal the truth. They found fragments of metal, pieces of equipment, and traces of what had once been carried by the men who entered that structure the night before. The conclusion began to form even before it was spoken aloud. The slave catchers had not left. They had been inside when the fire consumed the building. The sheriff questioned everyone who had gathered near the scene, his voice firm, his eyes sharp as he looked for hesitation or inconsistency. People answered carefully, offering only what they could not avoid saying. No one had seen how the fire started. No one had heard anything unusual until the flames were already rising. It was the kind of silence built not from ignorance, but from understanding. David stood among them, his posture relaxed, his expression unchanged as he responded to the questions directed at him. He spoke calmly, his words measured, giving nothing that could tie him to the events of the night. The sheriff watched him for a moment longer than the others, as if sensing something beneath the surface, but there was no proof, no witness, nothing solid enough to act upon. As the investigation continued, tension spread beyond the settlement. News traveled quickly through Alabama, carried by riders, traders, and anyone who passed along the roads connecting one place to another. The story grew as it moved, shaped by each person who told it. Some said the barn fire was an accident, the result of carelessness or bad luck. Others whispered that it was something far more deliberate, an act of resistance against men who had built their lives on hunting others. The idea itself was dangerous. It suggested that the balance of power could be challenged, that fear did not always belong to those who fear it, who held authority. Plantation owners grew uneasy as the story reached them. They increased patrols, tightened control, and warned their overseers to remain alert. At the same time, something quieter began to take root among the enslaved and the free black communities across the region. The story of the Alabama barn fire became more than an event. It became a symbol, not of chaos, but of possibility. It spoke of a moment when the hunted refused to remain helpless, when someone stood against the system and changed the outcome, even if only for a single night. David Iron Hands returned to his life with the same quiet routine he had always maintained. He worked when work was required. He spoke when words were necessary. He listened more than he spoke, allowing the story to move around him without ever stepping into its center. Inside, however, he understood the full weight of what had happened. The act had not ended slavery. It had not broken the system that still held countless people in bondage. But it had done something that could not be undone. It had shown that even within a world built on control, there were moments when control could be taken away. Sometimes those moments came quietly, hidden in the darkness, carried out by individuals who refused to accept the limits placed upon them. As the sun set on that day, the sky was painted with a palette of colors, from the soft pinks of the setting sun to the deep blues of the night, casting long shadows across the fields. Once again, David stood at the edge of the land and looked towards the distant tree line, where the two men he had saved had disappeared into the night. He did not know where they were now, whether they had reached safety or continued their journey toward freedom. But he knew this much. They had not been captured. They had not been dragged back in chains. And that alone was enough to give meaning to everything that had happened. The ashes of the barn would eventually be cleared. New structures would be built. The routines of the land would continue as they always had. But the memory of that fire would not fade so easily. It would remain in the minds of those who saw it, in the whispers shared after dark, in the quiet understanding that something had changed. And though no official record would ever speak the truth of that night, the story of David Iron Hands would continue to travel, carried by those who knew that justice does not always wear the face of the law. Sometimes it arrives in silence, sometimes it rises in flame, and sometimes it is delivered by a man who has simply decided that enough is enough. The weeks that followed the Alabama barn fire carried a strange mixture of fear and quiet change. On the surface, life returned to its familiar patterns. The fields demanded labor, the roads carried riders back and forth between towns, and the law continued to move with its usual authority. Yet beneath that surface, something had shifted in a way that could not be easily seen, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. With its usual authority, yet beneath that surface, something had shifted in a way that could not be easily seen, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among themselves, only felt. Plantation owners spoke more carefully among lowering their voices when discussing the incident. They strengthened patrols and warned their overseers to remain vigilant, but there was an edge of uncertainty in their actions that had not been there before. The idea that 3 experienced slave catchers could disappear in a single night, without witness and without explanation, is a compelling one, unsettled even those who believed themselves secure. Fear, once directed almost entirely at the enslaved and the hunted, had begun to move in a different direction. It had begun to look back at those who thought themselves untouchable. Among the enslaved and the free black communities, the story traveled quietly but steadily. It was never told loudly, never repeated in places where the wrong ears might hear it, but it moved from person to person with a quiet strength that no law could fully suppress. Some spoke of a man with iron hands who had turned the tools of the oppressor against them. Others described the fire itself as if it had been guided by something more than human will, a force that answered cruelty with equal power. The details shifted with each telling, but the heart of the story remained the same. On one night in Alabama, the hunted had not run. On one night, someone had stood their ground and changed the outcome. That idea alone carried weight. It offered something rare in a world built on fear. It offered possibility, not safety, not freedom, not yet, but the understanding that resistance existed, even if it could only live in moments. Old roads carried the story farther than anyone expected. Traders passing through small towns mentioned it in cautious conversation. Wagon drivers spoke of it at stops along their routes. Even some white laborers, those who lived close enough to the edges of the system to see its cruelty, began repeating the tale in hushed tones. Each time it was told, the figure at its center grew slightly larger, less like a single man and more like a symbol. David Iron Hands became something more than a name. He became an idea that could not be easily controlled or silenced. That transformation was both powerful and dangerous. Legends attract attention, and attention can bring consequences. David understood this better than anyone. He did not encourage the stories, and he did not deny them. He allowed them to exist without stepping forward to claim them. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. His strength remained in his silence, in his ability to move through the world without drawing focus to himself. As time passed, the memory of the fire settled into the land like a scar that refused to fully fade. New structures were built where the barn had once stood, but those who knew the truth could never look at that ground without remembering what had happened there. For David, the place carried a deeper meaning. It was not a symbol of destruction, but of decision. It marked the moment when he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, when he had chosen to act rather than endure. The choice stayed with him, shaping the way he moved through the years that followed. He continued helping those who passed through the area, offering guidance, shelter, and silence when it was needed. He remained careful, always aware that the wrong step could bring everything crashing down. Yet there was a difference now, something subtle but undeniable. The fear that had once pressed heavily against his every decision no longer held the same power. He had faced it, acted against it, and survived. That alone changed what was possible. The Alabama barn fire did not end slavery. It did not stop the hunters or dismantle the laws that supported them. But it did something that history often overlooks. It reminded those living within that system that power is not always absolute. It can be challenged, even in small, hidden ways. It can be disrupted by individuals who refuse to accept the roles forced upon them. For those who heard the story and carried it forward, that lesson mattered. It became part of a larger, quieter resistance that stretched across the South, connecting people who might never meet but who shared the same understanding. That understanding would grow in the years to come, feeding into movements and moments that would eventually reshape the nation itself. And at the center of it, though never written in official records, remained the memory of one man, one night, and one fire that refused to be forgotten. Years passed, and the land remembered even when people tried not to. The Alabama soil where the barn once stood changed with the seasons, grass growing over the blackened scar, new wood rising where old beams had fallen. But memory has a way of settling deeper than the surface. Those who had seen the fire, those who had heard the screams carried through the night, those who had stood at a distance and understood without speaking, carried that moment with them long after the flames were gone. It moved with them into other places, into other conversations, into quiet teachings passed from one generation to the next. The name David Iron Hands was not spoken loudly, and often it was not spoken at all, yet the story remained. It became something shared carefully, almost like a secret that held both danger and strength. Some told it as a warning, others as a lesson. But all who carried it understood that it represented more than a single act. It represented a line that had been crossed, a moment when fear did not win. David himself grew older beneath that same southern sky, his life continuing in the rhythm forced upon him, yet never fully defined by it. The years added weight to his shoulders and lines to his face, but they did not dull the clarity in his eyes. He continued to work, to listen, to guide when guidance was needed. Those who came after him, younger men and women who had not seen the fire with their own eyes, often felt drawn to him without fully understanding why. There was something in his presence, something steady and unshaken, that spoke louder than words. When he shared stories, they were not about fire or violence, not about what he had done, but about endurance, about knowing when to move and when to wait, about protecting one another in a world that offered little protection in return. Yet beneath those lessons lived a deeper truth, one that shaped the way people listened to him. They understood, even if they could not prove it, that he had once stood in a moment where everything could have been lost and had chosen to act. Beyond the fields and forests of Alabama, the world continued to change. The tensions that had been building across the nation grew stronger with each passing year. Debates turned into conflict, and conflict began to reshape the very foundation of the country. Though David did not stand in halls of power or speak in places where laws were written, his story existed within that larger movement. It was one of many, one of countless acts of resistance, courage and defiance that never found their way into official records, but still played a role in shaping history. The Alabama barn fire became part of that unseen current, a reminder that change is not always driven by those whose names are recorded in books. Sometimes it is carried forward by those who act in silence, whose choices ripple outward in ways they may never fully witness. The idea of resistance, once planted, does not fade easily. It grows. It spreads. It finds new ground in the hearts of those who hear it. One evening, many years after that night of fire, David stood alone at the edge of the land, watching the sun sink slowly beyond the trees. The sky burned with deep shades of red and gold, colors that reminded him, in a quiet and distant way, of flames that once lit the darkness for very different reasons. The air was calm, the world still, as if time itself had paused for a moment. He thought of the men who had come riding with chains, certain of their power. He thought of the two who had escaped into the night, their lives carried forward beyond that moment, and he thought of the choice he had made, the line he had crossed, the fire he had set. He did not see it as glory. He did not see it as something to celebrate. He saw it as something necessary, something that had been waiting, building, demanding to exist. As the last light faded and the first stars appeared above him, David Ironhands turned away from the horizon and walked back toward the life that remained in front of him. And though the world would never record his name in its official history, the truth would endure. On one night in Alabama in 1851, a man chose to stand against the weight of a system built to break him, and in doing so, he proved that even in the darkest chapters of history, there are moments when the human spirit refuses to bow and instead rises like fire to be seen. Thank you for watching Shadows of Black History. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe and like the channel so more hidden stories from the past can be told. And always remember, history is not only written by the powerful, it is also carried in the quiet courage of those who dared to resist